Hi everyone, welcome to the Swift Arcade. I'm your host, Jonathan Rasmussen. So happy that you're back with us today. We're going to continue our journey with the Starbucks app. We are going to build this view today. This is a table view with some data that we've parsed with JSON that we've extracted from an HTTP request to an Amazon Web Service. And in this episode, we're not only going to build this UITableView that populates that remote call into the view here, we're going to learn about a powerful new concept, something called a view model, which will help you bridge data coming from the outside world and bringing it into the inside world in your app. So if you're interested in that, come join us in this episode of the Swift Arcade. So before we jump into the code, let's just take a quick look at the map and see where we are on our journey here. In episode 1, we saw how we could take JSON coming from an AWS web service and transform that into a Swift object that we could use and understand in our app. In the episode after that, we then saw how to make an HTTP request using URL session and task and actually extract that data from AWS and also parse it. And right now, we're at step 3 here, where we're going to put that data and use it in our application by building this view. So we're going to construct a table view, we're going to populate with some fake data, and then you're going to see how to bridge this world from the outside into the inside using something called a model view. So when it comes to model views, what's really cool about them is we are going to build a data structure exactly for our UITableView, containing the data exactly in the most perfect form we want. And that's really going to help us populate our table view. We're going to take our data from the outside world and bring it in here by basically creating some simple constructs in Swift that just make that easy for us. For example, we could create something in here called a history section, which has a title and the transactions for each of these sections we want to build. We're going to create a history model representing that, and that's what's going to translate between the two worlds for us. So that in a nutshell is what we're going to do in this episode. Let's now jump into the code and see how we can build that from scratch. Okay, so let's fire up Xcode and let's go Shift-Command-N to create a brand new project here. We are going to start with what we usually start with here, just a single view app, brand new single view app. Let's call this, we're going to call this history view just for now, just for something to give it a name. And we're just going to stick it on our desktop. And we're going to bring in some old code for some previous episodes as we go. So don't worry about having everything at your fingertips, but we are going to create our view here from scratch. So in this case, because I don't want to use storyboards and I want to set these up in a specific way, I'm going to go ahead and just make this project storyboard free. And I usually do this when I'm creating brand new applications because I like working programmatically. So we're just going to go ahead and remove the reference to the storyboard. We're going to remove this file called scene delegate. We don't need that. Go ahead and we'll move that to trash. And then what I usually like to do is just click on the directory up here and go new group without folder. So I don't want a physical folder on disk. I want just a virtual folder like this, which I'm going to call files. And I'm going to drag all the stuff I don't really care about right now, which are assets, launch screen, storyboard, and info list into that directory here, just to park them and get out of the way. And now I've got the two files that I actually care about, app delegate and view controller. Just going to go into app delegate here, make a little bit of room on the right by getting rid of that, and then going to delete all this code in the app delegate. And then I'm going to use my handy dandy code snippet here. This is just some pre-generated code that allows me to create and instantiate a view controller and stick it on my root view controller like this. And now basically I've got a story-free app, which if I run will fail because I forgot one more important step here. In the info P list, there's two entries we also need to delete. We need to delete this main storyboard file base name. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that entry. And then there's also an application scene manifest in the info list. I'm just going to hit that little negative sign and get rid of that. And now if we go Command R, hopefully we will have a white canvas with a clean slate and we are good to go. Okay, let's start off by just creating a plain old table view because that's ultimately what we really want. We want to construct something that looks like this, and this is just a plain table view with some sections. So let's just build this up piece by piece. Let's go into our application now, and let's just do two things. First, let's just rename ViewController to be History ViewController, because that is ultimately what we want. And we'll also need to rename the class here. So I'm just clicking on what was ViewController, and I'm renaming it History ViewController, both the class and the file name. And then an app delegate, let's also instantiate a History ViewController here. And now we've just got a better named file. Let's now click on that History ViewController. And there's a couple ways we could go ahead and build this. One, we could create a table view, a UITableView, put it in this view controller and pin it to the edges and lay it out using standard auto layout. But because this is a pure table view, we can actually make use of the UITableViewController in its entirety. And that'll already have the table view instantiated, will already be set up as the delegate and data source. It'll all be hooked up for this. So this is actually a good case to actually extend something called a UI table view controller, just like this. Now I'm going to drop in some code here and just quickly walk you through how this works here. And basically, this is just our history table view. We're going to extend this thing called a UITableViewController, which is the controller we're going to present. And like all table views, we need some data. So first, I'm just going to create some fake data here. These are just classic arcade games. We're going to go ahead and that's what's going to be initially appearing in our table. We need cell IDs, which identify each row in our table view. This is just a string which identifies a cell ID. And then we're going to go ahead and just set this up. I'm going to rename this to be layout, because I just like layout more than what I had here, called setup views. And we're just going to go ahead and, if we were in a nav bar, we'd set a title here. We're going to register a default UITableView cell with this cell ID here. This is something all UITableViews need in order to populate themselves. And here's just the three things we need to create a table view. We need to give it a cell for each row, which is going to be the UITableView cell we register here with the cell ID. We're just going to unpack that here. When we get a cell, we're then going to set the text on the cell to just be the name of the game. So we're going to go into our game data here, and based on the row passed in, set that to be equal to text. We can have an accessory type here if we wanted to give a little indicator on the right-hand side. We return a cell from here. And then the rest of these are basically just how many rows we have in each section, which is just going to be our game.count. And if we did select a row, this would be a callback for us. We don't actually need this here. So I'm going to get rid of that. And just to make this a little bit more cleaner and separate, I'm going to go ahead and put this table view stuff in an extension down here. And the only reason I'm doing this is just to give a little bit of separation from the setup, from the table view work down here. And I might even give it a mark, which in Swift is a nice way to separate these things a little bit more. Mark data source, that means everything down here is related to my table view data source. And that's basically the simplest thing we can do to create a UI table in a UITableViewController and display it. So let's just run this and see what we get. And voila, there we go. We had a table appearing, it's scrollable, it's got some data, it doesn't go anywhere, but this is a good start. We can now build from this. Now the next thing would be really nice is if we want to build out this view here on the left, it would be nice if we had our data represented in a way that'd be really easy to populate and provide data for each one of these rows. So what we're going to do now is just create some test data. We're going to bring in the structures that we used when we parsed the JSON. That's ultimately going to populate this. We're going to create some test data we can easily pass our table view. And let's just see if we can't get something showing up here that isn't classic arcade games. So let's start by bringing in some structs that are going to help us. Let's go to the top of our history view controller and bring in the transaction which is going to represent ultimately what we parsed from our HTTP request. This is something we created in a previous episode. This transaction represents an element or a row of data from our JSON request. But also let's define a custom struct, which is going to help us populate our view. In this case, something called the history section. History section here is going to represent the title of the section. So it's going to be your months like July, June, and May. But it's also going to contain a list of the transactions or a list of rows which belong to each section. And this is a really good thing to do. Remember, we can create structs that make our lives really easier when populating these views. That's all a history section is. We're going to create some test data now to build this up. So let's go back into View.Load. And whoops, I didn't actually want to call that method layout. I would rather call that style. So what I did there, just to do it again, is if you want to rename a method or a function conveniently in Xcode, you can go Control-Command-E. That'll highlight it, all instances in the file, and you can just retype the name you'd like. In this case, I want to call it style. Just a nice way to do a simple refactoring. It's only good for the class, but it's just a handy thing to know. Let's create another method in here called data. Whoops. And let's create our test data in. So just under style, we're going to come in here. I'm just going to copy in a method or a function here. And let's just see what is going on here. So basically, we want to create some test data that basically populates the rows here. So I'm just going to create some transactions, some fake transactions, just like the ones we're going to get when we parse the JSON from our HTTP request. I'm going to create a transaction 1, 2, and 3. They're going to be populated with the data that we would normally get. And I'm just going to group them in history sections. So I'm going to create a history section for that very first bit, July, which is basically going to be July. And then I'm going to stick one row in there, all the ones. Then I'm going to create something for June. I'm going to put 2 transactions in there, the 2s. And then I'm going to put all these 3 transactions in one called May. And I'm going to group those in an array we have not created yet called sections, which are really going to nicely populate the sections of our table view. So if I just come up here now, and instead of these games, I'm going to get rid of games. This isn't going to be our data source anymore. I'm going to create a var here called sections, and it's just going to be an array of history sections, which are going to populate these areas here. So now we've got our data. This is our test data. We're good to go. Now we just need to populate it and make use of it down here. Now the first thing that's going to be different is we need to actually make use of sections now instead of just throwing rows into our table view. So the way sections work in a UI table view is like this. We get something called an index path. That index path is going to also tell us what section we're in. So we can create a let here, just saying, hey, here's the section we're in. And then from that now, we want to get the transactions for that section. So we can switch on the section and say, if we're in July, which is going to have an index of 0, grab the transaction, all the transactions, sorry, for this row for July. So here we're going section 0, which is going to be our first section here. We're going to grab the transactions from it. In this case, it's only going to have one, transaction 1. And we're just going to grab the row, which would correspond to that transaction, which in this case will be 0. And we're going to get the transaction. And then we can set, in this case, we're just going to take the amount from the transaction and set that in the label text. Then we can do the same thing for section 1, which in our case will be June. For each row as we go here, we're going to grab the June or the May section, grab the appropriate row, and then set that amount on the cell. So that's kind of how sections work. Now that gives us the data, but we also need to tell it the right number of rows. In other words, we can't just go, there's this many rows now, because we need to take into account, well, which section are we in? So we just do some very similar looking code here when it comes to the number of rows. In this case, we're conveniently past the section we're already in, so we don't need to grab it from the index like we did above here. Now we can just switch and go, if we're in section 0, 1, or 2, get the appropriate count, and that will tell us how many rows we have in that section. There's then some things we can do in order to populate titles and set cell heights and things like that. Let's just walk through that. So there's another method on our table view here called title for header in section. This is what's going to give us the title for each of our sections, our July, our June, and our May. And in a very similar way, we're told what section we're in. Now we just need to grab the section and pull the title from it. Remember, that's how we created history section in the first place. Each history section has a title and its transactions. And this is a struct you and I created just to make our lives easier when it goes to building this table. So that's really handy. So here we can go ahead and grab the section we're in, grab the title, and then just return it. And if we don't have a title, that's fine. We'll just return nil because that's an optional string. Here, I just know that I'm going to want to set some height for each header in the section. I just picked this number 80 because it looks nice. We can also set a height for the row at. That can also be 80. How many sections do we have? No problem. We just go to our sections and we return the count. And then here, if we want to give our headers or our sections, just a little bit of color, we can also return the color here. View display header view actually returns the view for that header. These sections are also called headers. And we can actually give it a nice tint. In this case, we're going to give it tile brown. Now, one class we don't have here that we used in the earlier Starbucks app is our factories class. So I'm just going to go ahead and create that now because that's going to define our color for us. I'm going to go Command N. I'm just going to create a new file here called factories. And don't worry if you don't have this. This is just from a previous project where we've been building up the Starbucks app. I'm just going to copy it in its entirety here. But what we're really doing here is we're just getting this tile brown here. And with this tile brown, we should now be able to, in our view controller, style that. Okay, let's run this and see what we get. Hey, voila, that's not looking too bad. We've got some headers here, some sections. They've each got our transactions, 1, the 2s, and the 3s. And that's really good. We're slowly building up our table view and populating it with data. Okay, so this is beginning to take shape. This is really nice. The next obvious thing is instead of just displaying these numbers here for our transactions, it would be nice if we could style these rows a little bit more kind of how we want here. Now, if we look at these don't match any default table view cells that we get for free with UITableView. We're going to have to create our own here. And the way to do that is to create our very own UITableView cell, which we will use in this table that we're free to style however we like. So let's go back into Xcode now. Let's create a brand new file. Let's call it history view cell. And I'm just going to move you up here so you sit under there. And let's just walk through how we could actually create one of these cells, lay it out, and set it up. So this is going to be just a regular class called a history view cell. It's going to extend a UITableView cell, so we get all the good stuff there for free. And in here, if we look at this layout, when we're designing our cell, we just want to walk through and basically walk through and lay out these elements in this cell here. So we're going to want to have a star view here. In our factory class, we have a method which is going to return for us the SF symbol for a star view, which we get through this configuration and everything. But basically what just happens is we pass it the system name in SF symbols, which happens to be star, and we get that for free here. So we're going to get a star view. We're going to define two labels here, a title label and a date label. And really all we need to do is lay those out in this pattern here. So here's just a standard initialization for a UITableView cell, where you pass it a cell style and a reuse identifier, and then you initialize it. And I've just got two methods here, config and layout, where we're going to configure the cell and then lay it out. This is just an initializer that we need by default. I'm going to talk about this transaction thing in just a second. Let's just pass over that for now. And let's just walk through how we're configuring and setting up the cell. Okay, so we're using auto layout. So we instantly need to make sure that all of the elements in our cell here are set for auto layout but making translate auto resizing mask into constraints, that's a mouthful, into false. And then basically we're just going to style or configure each of our elements here. So for our star view, we're going to give it a nice star yellow color. We're going to set its content mode to aspect fit, so it fits in there nicely. And for the title label, we're just going to give it a font of headline. That's going to bold it here. And date, we don't really need to do anything. We're just fine with you as your standard font as you are. Okay, so here's the auto layout bit. We just take each of our views, add them to the subview, because the UITableView cell is just a view in itself. So we're just adding these to our cell, and then we just lay it out here. I'm just going to go Command 0 to give us a little bit more space. Star view, starting on the left-hand side, we're going to go leading anchor, equal the system spacing after this edge here, multiplier of 2. Each multiplier here is 8 points, so that's going to give us a nice little 16 space here. Then we're going to set some height and width, 36 points, just something that I picked. We're going to center it on the Y, which means on the Y-axis, we're going to center it right in the middle here. And that's our star view laid out. For the title label, we're just going to follow the star view. Its leading anchor here is going to be equal to the system spacing after the star view trailing here. We'll give it a multiplier of 2 also. And we will center its Y also within the view. Then for the trailing over here, we can just go and pin it to the side here. Here we can go trailing anchor constraint is equal to the system spacing after the date label, trailing label. That pins it here. And here we give a little bit more spacing of 4, and we can also center it on the Y. So that's how we've laid out our very own UITableView cell in a row like this. Now let's come back here and talk about this transaction, because we need to get data into here somehow. And this is basically a nice method or pattern for doing it. When you want to populate your table view cell, you simply create a computed var and make it optional like this of the entity you want to populate it with. So in our case, it's going to be our transaction. That's what contains this data. Once we get that, because it's an optional, we will unwrap it here with the guard clause. But once we've got it, we're now free to take all the data from it and set it up on our elements here. In this case, we just want to take the transaction amount and build this sentence here, 150 stars, and then based on the type redeemed, that's what's going to set that title label. And for our date, we're just going to create a little date formatter, format it the way we want here with month, 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 and then day. And we can take the date from our transaction and set it up on the date label like this. So that's how we can populate that row. And I'll show you just in a few minutes how we're actually going to call this and set all this up. But that's basically our UITableView cell. Now to make use of our cell, I'm going to go Command 0 to bring back our menu over here. Let's go back into our history view and actually use this new cell we just created. And there's just a couple of things we need to do. One is we're no longer going to dequeue registration here. We're no longer going to use the UITableView cell. Now we're going to use the cell we created. So this is going to be our history view cell. That's the cell we're going to register with the table using the same identifier. There's also, so that's good. That's how we register it. Now there's also something else we can do. We need to dequeue it. And when we dequeue it now, we're not going to dequeue it the way we did before. Where's our dequeue? Ah, here it is. I'm going to go Command 0 again, just to give us a little bit more space. Now when we dequeue it, instead of getting that simple cell we were before, we're going to get back our history table view cell. And we can do that with code that looks like this. It's the same method call. Let me just leave the old one here. It's the same method called dequeue reusable cell with identifier cell, only this time instead of getting back a table view cell from this call here, we're going to optionally cast it into a history table view cell. If we can do that, which we should be able to because we've registered it, all will be fine. But if we can't, if there's a problem, then we'll just return a standard UITableView cell. So that's how we're going to use our new table view cell in our table. Then instead of just taking the transaction amount from our fake data and sticking it on the table view cell, now we're actually going to do something a little bit more cool. Because we've got the actual transaction for that row, which contains all the data, here is where we set it on the cell. And if we Control Command click into there, look, this is where we're actually going to set up the data on our cell. We're going to pass it in. Once we dequeue it and we know what transaction we've got, that's how we populate it into our cell right here. So that's how we're going to get our data in there. And that's basically it. If we run this now, we've got some real looking data in here. Things are looking much, much better. Just a couple things. One is it would be nice if we got rid of these dividers here. And two, it would be nice if we didn't have any footer cells at the very bottom, if we can get rid of those. We can do that if we go back to our style at the top here. And let's just add 2 lines here. Let's go table view separator style none. That will get rid of those lines separating our rows. And if we go table footer view is equal to an empty footer, that will also get rid of the empty rows at the bottom. So let's just run that now. And voila, there we've got a really nice indicator-free, separator-free, nice, smooth-looking table view populated and set up with our table view cell. Okay, so now that we've got our table view working, now comes the fun part. Now we get to bridge these two worlds. We get to take the data from a AWS HTTP call and bring it into our view and display it just like this. But now we're going to replace the fake hard-coded data with an actual HTTP call. And we're going to do all this work and the translation in our view model. So to help set us up here, Command 0 to bring this menu back on the left. And also another nice little shortcut is if you're not sure where this file is in your project, you can go Shift Command J, and that will instantly bring back the project navigator and show you where you are. Just another handy shortcut. So to set us up for this, let's go and bring in the history service, which is actually going to do this HTTP call and just copy it into this project for us. This is from a previous episode, so don't worry if you're not sure where this comes from. Just check the previous episodes and I'll give you a really detailed walkthrough of how the HTTP request works. So let's call this the history service. And I'm just going to copy all the code and bring it in here. But basically, in a nutshell, if you're just watching this episode for the first time, this is us doing the HTTP request to this URL, getting it back, decoding the JSON, and then returning a list of transactions. Now, the reason why it's complaining about history is this is a struct that we haven't created yet, but it actually goes as part of the Json parsing. So I'm just going to go back to UITableViewController and, here it is, right where our transaction is. I'm just going to add one more struct called history, and this is just necessary for JSON parsing. This is how we parse the JSON. But with that, that's all this service is going to do. It's going to do the HTTP call and bring it back to us. Just adding that file there to set it up. Okay, now the fun part. Let's come back to UITableViewController, and in this project here, let's create a new file. And let's call this history view model. This is going to be our Rosetta Stone for converting external data into something we can use perfectly nicely in our table view. And for now, I'm just going to copy this code in and then walk through it in detail with you to show you what's going on. So this is just a plain old Swift struct, history view model. It's going to set us up really nicely. And in there, we are going to have the sections or the same construct we used to populate this table, we're going to create as an attribute in here. This is our output for our display. This is what our history view model is going to give us when we ask it for it. Now, where's it going to get the data to create this array of history sections just like we did as fake data in our view controller? The input for that are going to be transactions from somewhere like an HTTP request. That's what we're going to feed into here, and it is going to translate that into a form we can understand for our table view. So how is it going to do that? Well, in this case, we've got 3 sections, July, June, and May. And just for simplicity of this app, I'm going to hard code. We're just going to support 3 sections right now. And I'm going to create basically a filter for each month, July, June, and May. And that's how we're going to take the transactions that are passed in here and filter them out. So what you're seeing here is basically some Swift filtering. All these transactions we have here, I'm going to get the date from the transaction and check to see if it starts with July, June, or May, and then just collect those transactions in a first, second, and third month. So just to show you what I mean a little bit more, this is the data that we're getting from the back end. And I'm basically just going to take the dates that are passed in here, check their month for July, June, or May. And that's how I'm going to separate this list of transactions coming to us in various sections. So I'm going to have a July, June, and May. I'm then going to create these history section objects, just like we did when we created the fake data. I'm going to give them a title of July, June, and May, along with their associated transactions. And then I'm just going to build up sections as a new array, sticking those in there. So I know this can look a little bit confusing at first, because if you don't understand really what's going on in the data, it can be hard to appreciate somehow all this filtering works. But really all we're doing is the exact same thing we did in UITableViewController. Just like how we created this fake data here, now we're doing it for real. We're getting it in our view model in the form of transactions being passed in, but we just have to do some filtering. So I'm just separating the months here, collecting them into a history section, and then appending them to an array here, which we can then get when we ask for the output of this history section. We're really building this in here. That's kind of what we're doing with the view model. And that's it. So to see this view model in action, let's now go back to our UITableViewController. And instead of using our fake data sections here, we're not going to need that anymore. We're going to put all that responsibility and that output into our history view model. So I'm just creating this as an optional here. This is something that's going to get populated when we actually do the call. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. Actually, now's a good time. Instead of calling and using our fake data here, we are going to basically fetch the real data with a method called fetch transactions, like this. So now we're connecting the worlds and we're hooking them up. I'm just going to comment out our fake data here because we don't need that anymore. And let's bring in this method called fetch transactions and just see what it does. I'm going to put you right here so we can see what you're doing. So now we're actually going to go and make the real HTTP call. We're going to call our history service. We're going to call fetch transactions. We're going to get back a result. And we covered this in a previous episode too. So if you want to go back and just see more of a thorough walkthrough of how all this works, go one episode before where we do HTTP requests. But basically, we're just taking the transactions from our HTTP request, and lo and behold, we're setting them on the view model. What happens when we do that? Well, that's where all this logic gets called that we just walked through. This is what's going to take those transactions, did set it as an observer on this property. This is what will get invoked after we set the transactions in here. And this is when it will do all that processing and basically set up these sections for us right there. Control Command left arrow to get back. So basically, we're just going to fetch transactions, populate this view model, and now we can use this view model in our table view with real data. So let's go down here and see how we can use this. And just to clean things up a bit, I'm going to get rid of this fake data. You can keep that around if you just wanted to play with it. We don't need you anymore. And we don't need you anymore. So to use the view model in here, see everything where we were using as our own fake data. Well, now we're going to use the real stuff. So the first thing we'll do is, because our view model is optional, we will unwrap it in our cell for row at. So we're going to get our view model. If it's here, we're going to get it. If it's not, we're just going to return a plain old UITableView because we have to return some kind of default. But then we can use it here instead of the fake data. Check this out. This is how we connect it. We're just going to call our view model and get the section data from it now. All we've done is we've taken the fake data we worked with here and passed that into our, and we're extracting it from our view model. We're just pulling it from there. That's how we can get it in the cell for at. And then we just repeat this process going through each place where we have this switch. For our number of rows and sections, we again just unwrap the view model. If there isn't a view model, we have to return something. So we'll just return 0, meaning there's no rows in this section. But if it's populated, we're going to get it like this. And same as we did before, now we're just going to get that data from our view model instead of our fake data like that. And then for the title and heading section, very same thing. We're going to unwrap it. In this case, we need to return a default value of optional string. I'm just going to return nil to show that there is no title for the header in this section. And again, we just get the actual title from our view model sections because that's where we'll now be populated. And same thing here for number of sections. Now we can actually get our sections from our view model and just return the actual section count here. And I think that's basically it. I think with this, we will now have a view model, which is going to take the real data, translate it into a form we can use, and then populate it in our table view. Let's see if we've connected the dots here. And we get a blank screen. That's not what I expected, but after some debugging, I realized I forgot to instantiate our view model here. So in style, if we just add the line view model is equal to history view model, that will help create it, enable us to populate it. And if we run it now, hooray, we should actually get a view populated with some real data coming from a back-end AWS web service. Good stuff, well done. Okay, so just a quick recap of what we've done in this episode. We created a brand new table view. We populated it with some JSON fetched from an HTTP web request, and we translated it into something really convenient for our view using a concept known as a view model. And that really helps us create our views in nice, elegant ways and really act as a translator between the outside world and our inside world when we present data. Just one more video to wrap up this little section of the history. Come back, and in the next episode, we'll see how to take this view that we created here and actually hook it up to our actual app as part of the history button in our Starbucks app here. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.